Thank you very much, Pavan. I'm very grateful for the invitation to come here. It's a fantastic honour, wonderful university, fantastic campus, beautiful buildings, and then you get the School of Architecture. And in that sort of theme, I think, therefore, it's okay for an economist to be talking about ecology. So I'm going to talk about this thing called the National Ecosystem Assessment. I want you to try and relax and just enjoy it. So everything that I'm going to show you is available. I've given this slide to Kavita, and she's put it up on your website. So just relax, don't worry about it. If there's any detail, just go to those papers. Okay, so what's the objective of this talk, and indeed of the whole undertaking that is the ecosystem service approach? Well, it's just really to improve decision making. There is one big assumption. Everybody kind of glosses over this. Steve Pulaski, I think, did the most honest iteration of it a couple of days ago. And that is that we should make decisions which optimize present and future human values. And of course, the emphasis there is on the human values. I'm not going to dwell too much on that. I'm sure you've thought about the implications of that throughout the course. It seems to me that the characteristics of a good ecosystem service decision-making system actually boil down to just three. You need sound science, you need sound valuation, and you also need sound costing. And costing may not be the same as valuation, and I'll come on to that right at the end of the talk. So I'm going to go through all three of these. But I want to start with some context. And the UK context is particularly interesting because they actually take it seriously there. They really do make decisions on the basis of the ecosystem service approach and on valuations of ecosystem services. They've got one of the longest histories of applying it, and you can see the variety of applications there. So taxes for landfill, for cars, regulation of wetlands first, and then nearly all natural areas now. Recreation, both urban and rural, being planned using values. Climate policy being driven by values. So if you are interested, the UK is a very good place to come and do this for real. And I will say, a brief advert, I have a job available right now for somebody who's really bright, really smart, quantitative, be working with a group with phenomenal resources, both monetary and intellectual. But unfortunately, I'd have to be your boss. But the others of them, they're really smart. They took things like when I say they, the UK government took things like the MEA, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, very seriously, and decided to basically go out and do one for the UK, which is a good idea, because you get an immediate advantage that you've got much better data when you restrict it to a smaller area, but also an area where data has been gathered for a very long time. The NEA was delivered this summer. It was actually written all the way through in conjunction with policymakers, and it was no coincidence, in fact it was completely timed, that a week later the government's new environmental policy came out and basically said, yes, this is what we're going to do. So they're actually doing it now. Conceptual framework, I'm sure you know a lot about this, but it's not looking at total values. I think environmental accounting is a very interesting undertaking, but it's very difficult to actually make policy choices with environmental accounting. So instead, we're looking at marginal changes. And those changes, driven by lots of forces, you can see them up there, and they impinge upon different types of capital, the sort of things that Steve Pulaski was talking about, natural capital and other capital. And these combine together. Natural capital delivers ecosystem services, combining with other capital to give us goods. And of course, by goods, I don't just mean those things that are in shops and stores, I also mean those non-market goods, which deliver values. Now, there's two types of values here. This one over here, collective values, I don't know much about that. and I'm not going to pretend to, but there was an attempt to look at whatever they are. I'm going to stick to the normal sort of economic side of it. But those values feed into the governance process, and a valuation exercise is undertaken. That valuation is increasingly sensitive to things like scale, place, and time, because all of those things are going to change values. Values for everything else change over time. Values change according to what place you're in, and that's also true of environmental values. And you'll see that the approach that we developed through the NEA is highly spatially sensitive. It's also temporally sensitive. This information goes out into decisions. They're implemented. Some very interesting work going on the implementation of these valuations. I'll only be able to talk about it briefly in the time available, but that provides another impetus back to a new driver of the system, so it keeps evolving round. This talk's going to look mainly at that bit up there, the relationship between natural and other types of capital, producing goods and producing values. So, I said that the first thing that you need for good ecosystem service decision making is sound science. And the National Ecosystem Assessment employed no less than 600 scientists. This is probably, I don't know if it's the biggest project in the world, but it's one of the biggest projects, certainly in Europe, that's ever been undertaken. And they, over a 2-year period, looked at what is happening and what has been happening over the last 50 years in trends of ecosystem services. Now, they tried to summarize it in one single diagram, which is a bit scary. It's this diagram here, but actually, I think it was a valid attempt. What they tried to do is say, well, you know, you can decompose the UK into a whole set of habitats, and you can look at the various values that these generate. And therefore, each cell tells you about how important a given habitat is to a given service. So obviously, enclosed farmland is very important for crops. That's why it's shaded dark. The arrows are the things that are interesting, though. They tell you about the trend in that service. Is it going up? Is it going down? Do we not know? Whatever. And so obviously with that particular example, it's going firmly up because food productivity has expanded over time quite dramatically. This was looking at the period from the end of the Second World War onwards. We can simplify that just in a few bullet points and basically say that since the end of the war, there's been a big increase in provisioning, but there's been decreases in lots of other ecosystem services. Over the last 10 to 20 years, there have been discernible changes in the path of ecosystem service delivery. Some services still declining rapidly, some of them beginning to show a reduction in the rate of decline, partly as a result of various regulations. Others actually beginning to improve, but overall, by 2010, we've got a status situation where about 35% are still declining, some from very low levels, and about 20% are improving. The remainder, constant or unclear. So, there is a massive report if you want to get it. That first page shows you where to download it. You can get the 1-page version, the 7-page version, the 50-page version, or the 2,000-page version. You know, whatever time frame you've got, it'll fit in. But let's now move on to the valuation side. These were the services that were identified for valuation, and all of these were valued. Money values were attached to all of these. How was this done? I know you've had some lectures on this, so I'll be brief. Some of them have market prices. Some of these market prices can't be used unadjusted because they're distorted. So, for example, food prices, particularly in Europe, are distorted by something called the Common Agricultural Policy. So you have to adjust to try and get the underlying value out of that. But nevertheless, you could start off with the market prices and then do that adjustment. Other things were valued by looking at their contribution to output. So there's quite a big effort looking at, for example, pollination services and seeing to what extent these actually contributed to food production and thereby finding a valuation for that service. Other things were valued by looking at the costs that were avoided by these services. So, for example, pollution remediation. For example, I noticed you've got some reed beds out there. I don't think they're being used for this, but certainly in the UK, reed beds are increasingly being used to clean up water contamination. Of course, that is providing a service that otherwise would be very costly. It's not a perfect way to value things, but it gives you something to put in the account sheet. A better way of valuing things is to look at observed behaviour, revealed behaviour. And here you can look at things like recreation, you can look at how far people are prepared to travel to different sorts of resources, the costs that they're prepared to incur with regard to that. Another approach, you can look at house purchases and the relationship with environmental quality. And finally, you can ask people questions, stated preferences. I've done stated preference research for a long time, and as a result of that, we didn't use this very much. Got to keep up. We came up with loads and loads of values, absolutely loads. This is just the start of a table that just goes on and on and on. We tried to come up with marginal values and also to use them. Most of these we were very interested in trying to get marginal value functions if possible rather than constants, because you would expect marginal values to change as the provision of a good changes. And then we tried to work out, when I say totals, I'm talking about totals of changes from a baseline under a set of different scenarios. I'm going to illustrate some of the procedures that we did by looking at those scenarios. Here they are, 6 scenarios. There was actually, each one of them is double because each one operates for a low emission and a high emission variant. You can see from the names the sort of things that these scenarios look at. Now, these scenarios were derived through a process that is not the way I'd have done it, but fine. It was a political science approach, talking to decision makers about the sort of future worlds that they were interested in or that they were worried in, and coming up with a set of functions which would end up with, which would be consequent from those different policies. We're going to look in particular at 2 of them. One's called Nature at Work, where there's a priority to enhance ecosystem services, and the other one, World Markets, where there's unfettered economic growth and trade liberalisation. Okay, how do we then illustrate what happens under these different scenarios? Well, we're going to look at a set of different values, and I've chosen these out of the long list of values to illustrate some different cases. So we're looking at agricultural output values as an example of a market price good, greenhouse gas emissions as an example of a non-market good, which almost certainly has constant marginal values. You could, for example, you could afforest the whole of Britain and it would store a fair amount of carbon, but it wouldn't really change the rate of global warming to the extent that the marginal value of sequestering a further tonne of carbon would really change that much. So you can in effect say these are constant marginal values. Recreation, a rural non-market good with very clearly diminishing marginal values. So, you know, if I put a wood at the back of the departments here, that would generate some non-market value, but if I put a second wood next to it, it's probably not going to generate any extra value at all, so the marginal values are going to go down pretty fast. Same sort of thing applies to urban green space amenity. Although, of course, it's of particular interest because of the proximity to large numbers of people. And finally, I'm going to focus the last part of my talk all on biodiversity, because what do you do when you don't believe the values that people come up with? So, I'll demonstrate the methodology and give you the messages. Start off with that first one, agriculture. Well, the first thing to think about agriculture is that it's the consequence of a whole variety of different drivers. There are policy drivers, there are market drivers, there's technology, and there's cross-sectional and temporal environmental drivers. The cross-sectional ones are really captured really well in a country like Britain. Although it's a really small country compared to the US, it's got a very heterogeneous landscape. We've got some really good wheatlands, we've got some absolutely rubbish rocks, basically, that you can't grow anything on. So great diversity. We've got a lot of places that are extremely wet and cold. We've got some other places that are less wet and cold, but not amazing. Unfortunately, we don't have quite the range that you've got across the whole of the US, but you know, there's some good variation there. You need a lot of data to do this, and you have to build models that are inherently spatial. And the great thing about working in the UK, and why really well qualified members of the audience should consider doing exactly that, is that there is phenomenal data resources which go back longer than probably any other country in the world. Now, we actually only use data back to the 1960s, but nevertheless, this was data that was gathered every 2 kilometres. There's 200 records taken right across the whole of Great Britain. We also got hold of 50,000 farm years of business data. And you stick these all together and you've got a hell of a lot of information about what farmers are actually doing. You can combine that with a lot of, again, highly spatially referenced data on the environment, how it varies temporally and spatially, cross-sectionally. Policy, which our EU policymakers have very kindly decided will be an almost perfect economics experiment because they keep changing their mind. And sometimes they'll apply policies in one place and not in another. So that's just what you need. And of course, over that period, since the 60s, you've got a lot of change in input prices and output prices. The model, it's a structural model, so it's very nice, theoretically compatible, estimated using some nice econometrics. It's all there if you want to find out about it. I'm going to use a very simplified version of it. You basically take a profit function, you stick it through duality theory, and you come up with production functions. Example, cereals. So the area of cereals within any 2 kilometre block is a function of lots of things. It's a function of economic market pressures. The price of cereals, nice and positive there. The price of fertilisers, nice and negative, just what you'd expect. Policy has a big impact because they keep saying to farmers, grow more wheat. No, don't grow more wheat. Grow more wheat again. And so every time they do this, it has big impact on farmers. In fact, we found some very nice lagged effects. Farmers actually respond faster now to prices than they do to policy. And I think it's a real consequence of the fact that you don't know if that policy is actually going to stay around very long. And lots of environmental stuff. And there's some that I want to pick out for you. These down here, degree days, that's basically a measure of temperature during the growing season. And this is rainfall, a measure, well, of precipitation. Thank God I could think of a different word, over the season. Why is that important? Because those things are going to change under a climate change scenario. How do we check whether this works? Well, you can run all the standard tests, but the best tests without doubt are to take some of your data and set it aside, re-estimate your models, take those models, estimate for the data that you've set aside, and see how good your predictions are compared to what actually happened. Okay, always the best way to test anything. You look at the standard tests, they work really, really well. Actually, a better test is the human eye. It's better than any R-squared, anything else. The human eye picks up patterns much better. And actually, it still works pretty well. This, I think, is about the toughest test you can give to a model, and it still works pretty well. There's two land uses coming out pretty nicely. Because we know we can predict for other periods, what we can now do is reassemble all the data, re-estimate it, and now say, well, what happens when something changes? And the thing that everybody's really interested in, of course, is climate. So what happens when climate changes? And climate is going to change quite significantly across the UK. You can see up there rainfall. It's actually going to get drier during the growing season. Temperature, thank God, it's actually going to get warmer. So what will this do to farming? Well, it'll change the pattern of farming quite dramatically out to the future. This is coloured with green being increases and red being decreases. And if we see here across this bottom layer a crop called oilseed rape, I don't know if you have it over here, but it likes drier conditions, and you can see all that green coming up as the future gets drier and warmer. Quite a number of areas currently used for dairying will actually become less suitable because of exactly the same factors. Areas getting drier, warmer, less suitable for pasture. What's this mean in terms of these scenarios? The scenarios vary not only climate, they also vary what's happening in policy. This is a map of income across farms at the moment. And I don't know if you know the UK at all, but basically all the green areas are nice lowland areas, often with very good soils, and so you're getting very high values. The sort of orangey area over, oh, what am I doing? Lost it. This area over, nope, don't know where it, oh. There, that's Wales, upland area, so it's lower values there. Uplands here, really high uplands up in Scotland, very low values. What's going to happen in the future when we get different policies going off and also climate change? Well, under the world market scenario, most of this map is green. And remember, green is good. It means that the values are going up. Whereas under the nature at work scenario, where there's an emphasis on all ecosystem services, actually there's constraints on agriculture, and we're actually getting some reductions in agricultural values in this world. So using the old style of making decisions, you just look at market prices, there is no doubt which world you would go for. You would go for the world markets scenario. And that's basically how decisions have been made all of our lives. Basically, we look at market prices, and that's what we do. And when we look at this world, and you know, the environmentalists get some control, and look what happens. They go and mess it up, and we don't get as much food produced as we could do. But, of course, there are other things coming out of this. One of the nice aspects of what that was done in the NEA is linking those land use models to other models, for example, hydrological models. So here you've got a model which says, well, as land use changes, it's going to have an effect on which crops are grown, and that's going to have big impacts on water pollution. And you can see there, those purple ones, that's sugar beet, massive amounts of nutrients going into waterways, particularly towards the end of the autumn, whereas switching to low-intensity pasture, much lower pollution levels, which of course then translates into different levels of ecological status. And one of the nice things about the NEA model is that you can cycle it round and you can keep nudging policy, changing land use and changing water quality and ecological status. But so what? Okay, down here we're going to get more scum on the water, eutrophication. Up there we're going to get more newts and salmon. So what? Well, is there a value attached to that? One of the things that we did was to see whether there was any relationship between environmental quality and recreational values. So we sampled a large and diverse area, went to people's homes, recorded where they live on a GIS, recorded where they visited, linked that subsequently to nationally available data sets on water quality. Back from the survey, find out how often people go to these places, and hopefully you should realise that we've now got all the information we need to conduct a travel cost analysis. So we can work out whether there is any association between water quality and visitation and therefore the value. And lo and behold, actually, when you control for all the other things that get British people to rivers, notably very highly significant was whether there was a pub on the river. But once you control for that, you do find that people go more to cleaner rivers. So we do care. You can apply these models across the whole of Britain. So here you've got a model here in pure quantity terms, how many visits were made in different places. Not surprisingly, it mimics where people live. There's London, there's Birmingham where I'm from, Liverpool, Manchester, Glasgow, Edinburgh. Just what you'd expect. And you can move from that, using those sort of models, to actually working out the value of recreation. And one very simple thing this shows you is it's a really good idea to improve environments near to where people live. So it's really blindingly obvious, but unfortunately, if you look at most EU policy, it makes no concession to where people live at all. So it's just as likely that they'll improve rivers in the middle of nowhere as rivers that go through the middle of towns. What's the consequence of these different worlds? Remember the world markets one? Well, the world markets one is one where we really go for agricultural intensification. And if you do that, you're actually going to lower values in many areas, particularly those areas around cities where at the moment a lot of agricultural areas are preserved for recreational access. If you go for the nature at work world, everything looks a lot better. Other values, greenhouse gases, brought in models of carbon fixing, brought in models of carbon release, because obviously plants fix carbon, but then they release it. So these are emission graphs for the usage of, in this case, timber. Makes a big difference how you use those different products. Soils. It really matters what sort of soil you've got and what usage it's under and where it is. All of these things affect the amount of carbon storage and the net change that occurs between different scenarios. Of course, an obvious one is machinery, but also other inputs like fertilizers. Fertilizers are produced using very heavily energy-intensive processes, so all that is captured in the model. And finally, these ladies are sort of making their own crusade for global warming, and therefore we need to count exactly what they're doing. Do all that, bring it all together, and you find that different scenarios generate very different levels of carbon emissions, which of course you can value using methods that I'm sure other people have told you about. So there's the world markets one. Now things don't look so good. All nastily red, whereas nature at work, a lot of it's nice and green. Last thing that I'm going to consider in terms of money is urban green space. Lots of studies of urban green space, they all basically come up with the same very obvious result that the closer you live to something like an urban park, on average, when you control for everything else, that will give you a higher house price. It'd be interesting to do that cross-culturally, actually. I'm not sure that that necessarily always works in the US, but definitely over in Britain, that's the relationship you get. And you can take that relationship and extrapolate it for different scenarios again across Britain. And in world markets, we lose a lot of urban green space, and nature at work, we actually gain urban green space. That's why you got green values here, red values over there. We can now put all of these values together. These are the initials of the 6 scenarios. Doesn't matter what they are, we're only just focusing on these end 2 ones here. So we've got nature at work and world markets. Remember the agricultural story. If we just look at market values, then nature at work stinks. It actually is worse than the present day. That's why I've coloured it red. Whereas world markets is fantastic. Nice green colour because it looks a lot better than the present day. It's actually the second highest net present value that you get out of any of the scenarios. It looks really good. But that's just considering one aspect of ecosystem services, provisioning. And we now know there's loads of them. There's carbon and recreation, all those other ones over there. And what's more, they all change spatially, and they change again under different scenarios. So you have massive change available to you. Now let's go back to that situation and add in all those other values. And you can see the result completely flips on its head. Actually, world markets is bad for the UK, for UK PLC. It actually generates a net value which is worse than the present day, whereas nature at work comes out with the highest value. If you're interested, all these results are on the web, and instead of just this simple ranking, you've actually got the monetary numbers attached to each one of them. Other things you can do with this, you can take value maps. So here's one of an area of Britain, Wales. And you can say, what would happen if we changed from agriculture, which dominates the country, to woodland? Well, you'd lose all this up here, this farming value. And if you're just doing a market analysis, this is all you'd gain in terms of timber. You'd never do it. And that's why Wales is completely covered by farming. There's virtually no woodland left there at all. But there's massive carbon benefits associated with woodlands, and there's massive recreational benefits. When we stick all those values together, we find that actually huge areas of the country should be under woodland if we actually counted all the values equally. Particularly down here near Cardiff and Swansea, a lot of people living down there, massive recreational values. Same up here because you've got people coming in from Liverpool and Manchester. That contrasts that map that you saw before with where forests actually are. You can see there's massive amounts of forestry here in almost exactly the wrong place. In fact, they've actually forested quite a lot of peatlands. Why? Because the market price of peatlands is really, really cheap. But from an ecosystem service point of view, it's a disaster because actually when you stick trees on peat, you actually dry the peats out and they emit huge amounts of carbon, far more than is stored by the trees. So you've actually got global warming forests in Wales. I want to finish off by extending this analysis to biodiversity. Great. I already said there's some aspects of the use value of biodiversity that I think you can value fairly readily. In fact, I think the big problem is the science. So pollination, the problem is not the valuation, it's actually understanding the relationship between, say, bees and production, which is not easy. However, what about, and I think you can look at recreation and biodiversity, that's fine as well. These are all use values. What about non-use values? I'm sure you've come across these. How do you assess them? Well, they're typically assessed using stated preference methods. As I said, I've done a lot of stated preference work, and I think it's absolutely fine to ask people questions about things that they know about. But biodiversity is not one of those things, and so I'm really pretty convinced that it's not a good thing to ask people about. Just to illustrate this, is a side study that we did recently, looking at how much people in Britain are prepared to pay for unique and non-unique animals that they're never going to encounter in the Cameroon highlands and in the Eastern Arc Mountains of Tanzania. We did ask them, have you ever been there, and are you ever likely to go there? And 100% said no to both questions. So these are pure non-use values. So we asked them about, these are choice experiments. You know what choice experiments are. It looks very technical, but basically you're still asking balmy questions. We said, you know, how much for the lion, how much for 13 frogs? And they gave us some amount. And then at the other extreme, we went to, instead of one site, we've got 2 sites now, and there's more frogs. So really, really should be better, but you get exactly the same values. You get complete non-scope sensitivity to these questions. Basically, people are just saying, please leave my house. I will say any number that gets you out the door. Of course, if we go to them and say, well, but what about 20 frogs and a gorilla, and it's unique, you know, in this area. If you get rid of it, there's no gorillas like this anywhere else. Then people say, oh, I'll give you a bigger number for that. So basically, we love things like gorillas, but we have no sensitivity to some of the vital species which make up the food webs, which actually make places viable for creatures like gorillas. So 2 questions. Do stated preferences reflect, stated willingness to pay using these methods reflect people's preferences? Possibly they do. People want to protect charismatic, unique species, but are these preferences a good basis for making sustainability policy? Absolutely not, because there's no sensitivity to anything that is not big and furry with big brown eyes, and therefore no concept of food webs, and actually that you do have to have the horrible slimy stuff in order to get the big brown eye stuff. So I don't believe that we can rely on these non-use values for biodiversity. What then should we do? Should we give up as economists? Definitely not. I think we can pursue a more sophisticated approach to cost-effective provision of existence of species. I'm going to finish with this case study from Sumatra. So Sumatra is an absolutely amazing place. You get these incredible species there, pangolins, tigers, siamangs, but there is an ecological, actually it's too late to say there's an ecological disaster going on. It's already happened there. Most of the place has gone already. You see these sort of statistics there. I'm not going to read them out. They're really pretty grim. The real force that's happening here is loss of habitat. So we were extremely lucky. We got in with a business group in central Sumatra. I'm not allowed to tell you exactly where it is, but they basically almost allowed us to take over a major plantation for 4 years. When I say take over, they operated it, but we were on site. There was somebody on site from the group the whole time. They completely opened the books to us. They allowed us to do a variety of ecological experiments there, seeing what would happen if you tore down tiger fences, what would happen if you didn't put poison around the area. lots of different experiments like that. Those are written up in a variety of papers. But I'm going to talk about an economics analysis that we did there. So this is the plantation, or rather it's the concession. You can see the boundary of the concession is all the coloured bit. The yellow part is areas that are intensively cultivated for palm oil. Red is the roads. So, as I say, they opened up their books to us. We, throughout the period, monitored all of the revenue that they were getting in, the costs that they were paying, and in the end we ended up with a data set of about 2.5 million records for the period, all of it spatially referenced. And that allows you to do some interesting things. For one thing, you can work out the fact that the costs of conservation, which of course are primarily, well, there's two elements. One is preparation of land for conservation. That's generally fairly minor. But the big cost is profit foregone. And you can find out that the opportunity cost of conservation is very definitely not constant. And actually that information is going to drive at least half of this analysis. So the costs are not constant. What you find is that, oops, a daisy, wrong one. The costs are highest near to the milling plant. Why is that? Well, it's obvious, because the costs of getting the stuff, the palm oil, to the plant are very low there. They're always, of course, the costs are always really high in any area that is already planted. When you're looking at an area that's a long way away from the plant and isn't currently under palm, then the costs are much, much lower. You don't have to make roads, so there's a cost saving there. You're not destroying existing crops, that sort of thing. So lots of heterogeneity in the cost side, which is going to be very helpful. What about the effectiveness of conservation? How many animals are you actually going to create, in effect, by moving land into conservation? Did an enormous data gathering exercise, so 1,000 kilometres of transects were walked over the period. Every time an animal was seen, it wasn't me doing this because I wouldn't know one from another, these were trained ecologists, they said what it was and recorded using a GPS where it was. That data was then fed in through a GIS and could be related to the conditions of the area. These are the sort of animals that were there. Wonderful animals like the leopard cat. Absolutely gorgeous. Considered of no value whatsoever, which I think reflects the absurdity of people's preferences. Basically, there's a lot of these. They're considered the rats of the jungle, and so nobody cares. The same thing about the pig, although the pig has one very, very useful purpose in that it's the main food of the tiger, which we did actually have on the site, but not in sufficient numbers to do a study. What we did have in sufficient numbers was lots of things on the IUCN red list, like cute guys like pangolins, which are absolutely lovely. And also on the red list, lots of apes. So apes, monkeys, I never remember which one it is, gibbons. Pull all this data together and you can begin to get some relationships, some spatial relationships. I could talk through that, but it's quicker to actually just do this and say, there's the map of the plantation, and here is the suitability of land conversion for conservation. And basically the green areas are the areas where if you convert these, you'll get lots and lots of animals in. Convert the red areas, you won't. And really, it's, you know, occasionally I tell my mum about what I do, and she looks at stuff like this and says, they pay you to do this. It's really obvious. Basically, it's a good idea to convert land next to primary forest. Well, I do get paid for it, so anyway, that's fine. Everybody's happy. But lots of heterogeneity again. So I can take that and I can reintroduce the heterogeneity in the cost side as well. And now I can do a cost effectiveness analysis, which basically means just that. Which are the areas which deliver the best conservation at the lowest opportunity cost? And it's these darker areas down here, obviously. Well away from where the mill was, and obviously near the forest. But there is a question. There is a question.
How sensitive is it to just the milling side?
So to the
just the milling? You're talking about
yeah.
The milling side. Are there other factors, or is it? I'm just wondering if that was the measured business model. What I've been wanting to say, what's the milling sides everywhere? Is all of a sudden the results getting better?
It absolutely would be sensitive to it. It's also sensitive to where the roads are, and that's hardly surprising. I mean, you see these dreadful studies of what's happening in Brazil, what's been happening for 20 years in Brazil. Roads are killers. Once you've got a road, that's where it all fans out from. So everything's spatial. And that's what we as economists have got to catch up on. You know, where it is really, really matters. Yeah. So, thanks. Is it enough? So we looked at, there's 3 different sizes of reserve that you could establish within the concession. Concession's pretty big, it's about 40,000 hectares. So you could have a 5,000. I don't know why we came up with these numbers, I'm sorry. They now look really weird to me, but I'm sure there was a reason. It was the ecologists that came up with these numbers. I'm sure I'd have gone for 5, 10 and 20, but anyway. These are the numbers of these are all red list species. The ones in the box are sufficient, the ecologists tell me, to be a viable population on their own. They could actually last and breed and keep going. And so that's pretty amazing, that actually even with the 5,000, you've got viable populations for most of them. When you get to the 11,000, all of them have hit viability. Okay, all right, yeah. I should have said there is a whole lot of institutional stuff going on at the moment on certification to actually make this happen. There's still a problem though. Why should a producer do this? Even though you know, we've made it incredibly cost effective, we minimise the cost for them and maximise the amount of biodiversity given that cost, why should they do it? Well, there's no reason. Why should they reduce their profit at all? Well, there's a guy here who isn't here. Okay, I was going to be nice to him, but he's not here. Matt Cochin has done quite a lot of study on work on this stuff. It's rubbish. No, it's really good stuff. God, if that's on video, damn. Okay, it's really, really good, especially his paper in JPE. Looking at how you might get people compensated for this stuff, you've got real problems. You can't stick the money through the government. Absolutely not. Totally corrupt. That's on video as well. Oh well. Voluntary schemes, well, people around there just can't afford it. But there are people in developed countries that are interested in paying extra amounts for goods that are chemically, physically, absolutely identical, but produced in different ways. So we undertook an experiment back in the UK looking at people's preparedness to buy different products which were identical in all ways apart from the fact that they were labelled as coming from plantations like this one that were actually undertaking conservation-friendly activities. And what we found was that you could actually get a price premium from this. There's a paper, if you're interested, in a journal called Oryx, which I realise I haven't put up, showing that actually you can move this premium around quite a bit by the way you present this. But a 15% increase was really quite robust. So, if you go into conservation, you're going to incur costs. Even if we minimise them, there's still going to be more costs than you were bearing before. So the question is, does the fact that you can then label your product as conservation friendly increase your revenue to the extent that your profit actually goes up or not? Well, the answer is yes. If you go for the smallest conservation zone, the 5001, okay, then actually the costs that you incur are small enough relative to the revenue increase that you actually increase your profit. You actually make more money going into biodiversity friendly production than not. So no longer do you have to rely on exhortations to companies to be nice, which I personally think is a complete waste of time. And I'm not saying that to say that companies are nasty. They are mandated to make profits. Now what you can do is you can turn it into their self-interest to actually get into conservation. These companies are run by people just like you and me. They would like to do nice things, but they're mandated not to. But if you can make it profitable to them, suddenly you can actually see conservation pay. That's the way that really I think this should be done. I'm conscious that we're just about out of time. I was going to talk, are you sure? Okay. I was going to finish off very quickly by talking about payments for ecosystem services, the cost side. Two types of cost: regulation cost, very important, opportunity cost. I'm going to talk more about that because that's really the focus of payments for ecosystem service research. And just to illustrate that there is a problem, back to the UK. So we've got a case study here in the air catchment. Very diverse again. There's a problem that the air itself is pretty polluted. Nutrients from farms in particular leading to very high levels of eutrophication. I'm not saying you can walk across the river, but it's pretty grim. And it's a very important river because it goes right through Leeds and Bradford, so there's a lot of people there that would benefit from having a clean river, as we've shown in the other studies. You can look at a variety of ways of tackling the problem. And the interesting thing is that the problem can be tackled in ways which have different effectiveness in terms of how well they reduce pollution, and very different costs. Those are millions of pounds inside a relatively small catchment per annum. So the cost effectiveness, in other words, the pounds per milligram of nutrient reduced, is very, very different according to which way you go. I did the same thing for poo as well. So if we want to go from this situation here to this situation there, there's going to be costs. Will there be benefits? Well, we apply the approach that we did before, and actually it turns out the benefits are much larger than the costs, but who's getting them is not the same people. So the benefits are basically to the urban community over here. The costs are to the farming community up in the top of the catchment. So there's an equity issue. We want to try and induce these farmers into ecosystem service schemes. So what are the characteristics of an ideal payments for ecosystem service scheme? Well, this is virtually the last slide, I think. First of all, they have to be incentive compatible. And I don't know to what extent you've been introduced to the ideas of mechanisms which actually make it in the interests of the person concerned to actually tell the truth. Have you done anything on this? No. Oh, that's a real shame. Well, it's really cool. I mean, for example, a very simple way in a lab, I say, you know, here's this bottle of fine wine. How much are you prepared to pay for it? And you're all thinking, wow, yeah, I love that wine. It's absolutely fantastic, but I'm going to say $1. Okay, and then I say, oh, by the way, I've actually got a mechanism. It might be a roulette wheel or something like that, and I'm going to chuck the ball in it, and a price is going to come up. Okay, so it's a random mechanism. And if you've bid an amount lower than that, then you're not going to get the wine. If you've bid an amount higher than that, you're going to get it, and you're going to pay the price that the roulette wheel says. Now you think about that. What's your optimal strategy? Well, your optimal strategy is to tell the truth. Suppose that your truth is $10. You love this wine, it's absolutely fantastic, it's what you want. And you think you're going to be strategic and you say, $6, okay? And the roulette wheel comes up $8. Well, you don't get the wine. And if you'd have told the truth, you would have got it for $8. So you can see there's actually a lot of very simple ways to induce people to tell the truth. Once you've worked it through with them once, I can see some of you pondering over that one. Take it home and think about it. You actually have no choice but to tell the truth. So you use incentive-compatible situations. You don't do, we've got this huge collaboration with this water company. They've given us about $500,000 to play with. And we're working with these ecologists, so they're lovely people. But they said, oh, we've come up with this great idea. We're going to get all the farmers together in the whole catchment, and we're going to get them in a pub, and we're going to buy them a couple of pints, and then say, tell us the truth. All right, tell us the truth. How much do you need to stop using fertilizers? And we were just like, no, that's not the way we're going to do it, honestly. You do the ecology, we'll do the economics. That's not the way we're going to do it. So you use these sort of mechanisms, and you can get really good results. Another real twist to that is to make these payments for ecosystem services partly dependent on outputs. Nearly all schemes in the EU, I don't know about the American situation, are input-based. They say, right, if you put a load of land into biodiversity habitat, we will give you this payment. Well, that's actually not what we want. We don't want land, we want biodiversity. We don't want you to say, right, this area's, I'm going to change how I'm farming this area for, say, water. What we want is clean water. So it's not the inputs that matter, it's the outputs that matter. So what you want to try and do is actually incentivize them also in terms of the outputs. So you actually say, for example, if in your area you can actually produce 3 breeding pairs of lapwings, which is something that's very interesting at the moment in Britain, you will get a bonus. On top of the guaranteed payment, you will get a bonus. Now, what will that do to farmers? Well, farmers are the people better than anybody else, better than economists even, but also better than ecologists at knowing their land. They will know just how good their land is for different types of activity. And they've actually probably got a pretty good idea of how good it is for wildlife. And therefore, if I'm a farmer and that knows that I can actually produce these sort of wildlife outputs that you're interested in, I know that I'm going to end up with a higher payment than my neighbour. Therefore, I'm actually prepared to actually go into contracts more readily than somebody who can't produce those outputs. In other words, it will attract in just the people that we actually want when we've got limited funds. So you stick those two things together, and then you just do very simple changes in the law, like this thing with the water company. All the water companies, up until last year, they were mandated to clean up the water. Okay? They're still mandated to clean up the water, but up until last year, they could only do that through treatment works. Now, they can do it by paying farmers not to pollute in the first place. Simple little rule change like that, and suddenly payments for ecosystem services become relevant to the private sector. Okay, conclusions. Things in Britain have not been particularly amazing over the last sort of 50, 60 years. Actually, they weren't that fantastic before that, but that was outside our period. Some things are beginning to pick up. You can use some useful analyses, mainly motivated so that decision makers understand it by things like scenario analyses, and actually show that most of the ecosystem services we're interested in can actually be valued. Non-use biodiversity values remain a problem, but I believe that we can go a lot further by more sophisticated, spatially referenced, cost-effective analyses. And I also believe that there's a lot of room to improve and incentivise the private sector to get involved with things like payments for ecosystem services. If you're interested, there is a new network, admittedly based in Britain, but you know, the electricity goes right the way across the Atlantic. You could sign up to this, it's completely free. This was launched 1st of January. The first 2 years were intended to get natural scientists, social scientists, especially economists, and policymakers together. So far, we've got, I think, 127 institutions already signed up for this. Hundreds of members from all over. Most of them are research, but we've got a lot of policymakers in there, and increasingly we've got private sector. In the second phase of it, there'll be a big expansion towards the private sector as well. Second phase starts end of next year. Thanks very much for listening. I don't know if we've got time for questions, but I really appreciate the chance to come and talk to you.